Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I'm here to continue our book, The Reptile Room, the second book in a series of unfortunate events by Lemony Snicket, illustrated by Brett Helquist, and published by Harper Collins. We're going to pick up where we left off with Chapter 6. Bad circumstances have a way of ruining things that would otherwise be pleasant. So it was with the Baudelaire orphans in the movie Zombies in the Snow. All afternoon the three children had sat and worried in the reptile room under the mocking stare of Stefano and the oblivious. The word oblivious here means not aware that Stefano was really Count Olaf and thus being in a great deal of a danger, chatter of Uncle Monty. So by the time it was evening, the siblings were in no mood for cinematic entertainment. Uncle Monty's Jeep was really too small to hold him, Stefano, and the three orphans, so Klaus and Violet shared a seat, and poor Sonny had to sit on Stefano's filthy lap. But the Baudelaires were too preoccupied to even notice their discomfort. The children sat all in a row in the multiplex, with Uncle Monty to one side, while Stefano sat in the middle and hogged the popcorn. But the children were too anxious to eat any snack, and too busy trying to figure out what Stefano was planning to enjoy Zombies in the Snow, which was a fine film. When the zombies first rose out of the snowbanks surrounding the tiny alpine fishing village, Violet tried to imagine a way in which Stefano could get aboard the Prospero without a ticket and accompany them to Peru. The town fathers constructed a barrier of sturdy oak, only to have the zombies chomp their way through it. Klaus was concerned with exactly what Stefano had meant when he had spoke about accidents. And when Gerda, the little milkmaid, made friends with the zombies and asked them to please stop eating the villagers, Sonny, who was of course scarcely old enough to comprehend the orphan situation, tried to think up a way to defeat Stefano's plans, whatever they were. In the final scene of the movie, the zombies and villagers celebrated May Day together, but the three Baudelaire orphans were too nervous and afraid to enjoy themselves one bit. On the way home, Uncle Monty tried to talk to the silent, worried children sitting in the back, but they hardly said a word in reply, and eventually he fell silent. When the Jeep pulled up to the snake-shaped hedges, the Baudelaire children dashed out and ran to the front door without even saying goodnight to their puzzled guardian. With heavy hearts, they climbed the stairs to the bedrooms, but when they reached the doors, they could not bear to part. "Could we all spend the night in the same room?" Klaus asked Violet timidly. "Last night I felt as if I were in a jail cell, worrying all by myself." "Me too," Violet admitted. "Since we're not going to sleep, we might as well not sleep in the same place." "Tico," Sonny agreed and followed her siblings into Violet's room. Violet looked around the bedroom and remembered how excited she had been to move in just a short little while ago. Now the enormous window with the view of the snake-shaped hedges seemed depressing rather than inspiring, and the blank pages tacked to her walls rather than being convenient seemed to only remind her of how anxious she was. "I see you haven't worked much on your inventions," Klaus said gently. "I haven't been reading at all. When Count Olaf is around, it sure puts a damper on the imagination." "Not always," Violet pointed out. "When we lived with him, you read about nuptial law to find out about his plan, and I invented a grappling hook to put a stop to it." "In this situation, though," Klaus said glumly, "we don't even know what Count Olaf is up to. How can we formulate a plan if we don't know what his plan is?" "Well, let's try to hash this out," Violet said, using an expression which here means talk about something at length until we completely understand it. "Count Olaf, calling himself Stefano, has come to this house in a disguise and is obviously after the Baudelaire fortune. And," Klaus continued, "once he gets his hands on it, he plans to kill us. Tadu," Sonny murmured solemnly, which probably means something along the lines of, "It is a loathsome situation in which we find ourselves." "However," Violet said, "if he harms us, there will be no way that he can get to our fortune. That is why he tried to marry me last time." "Thank God that didn't work," Klaus said, shivering. "Then Count Olaf would be my brother-in-law. But this time he's not planning to marry you. He said something about an accident." "And about heading to a location where crimes are more difficult to trace," Violet said, remembering his words. "That must mean Peru." "But Stefano isn't going to Peru. Uncle Monty tore up his ticket." "Doog!" Sonny shrieked in a generic cry of frustration, and pounded her little fist on the floor. The word generic here means when one is unable to think of anything else to say. And Sunny was not alone in this. Violet and Klaus were, of course, too old to say things like Doog, but they wished that they weren't. They wished they could figure out Count Olaf's plan. They wished their situation didn't seem as mysterious and hopeless as it did, and they wished they were young enough to simply shriek Doog and pound their fists on the floor. And most of all, of course, they wished that their parents were alive, and that the Baudelaires were all safe in the home where they had been born. And as fervently as the Baudelaire orphans wished their circumstances were different, I wish that I could somehow change the circumstances of this story for you. Even as I sit here, safe as can be and so very far away from Count Olaf, I can scarcely bear to write down another word. Perhaps it would be better if you shut this book right now and never read the rest of this horrifying story. You can imagine, if you wish, that an hour later the Baudelaire orphans suddenly figured out what Stefanos was up to and were able to save Uncle Monty's life. You can picture the police arriving with their flashing lights and sirens and dragging Stefano away to jail for the rest of his life. You can pretend, even though it is not so, that the Baudelaires are living happily with Uncle Monty to this day. Or best of all, you can conjure up an illusion that the Baudelaire parents had not been killed and that the terrible fire and Count Olaf and Uncle Monty and all the unfortunate events are nothing more than a dream, a figment of the imagination. But this story is not a happy one, and I am not happy to tell you that the Baudelaire orphans sat dumbly in Violet's room, and the word dumbly here means without speaking, rather than in a stupid way, for the rest of the night. Had someone peeped through the bedroom window as the morning sun rose, he would have seen 3 children huddled together on their bed, the eyes wide open and dark with worry. But nobody peeped through the window. Somebody knocked on the door. 4 loud knocks, as if something were being nailed shut. The children blinked and looked at one another. "Who is it?" Violet called out, his voice crackly from being silent for so long. Instead of an answer, whoever it was simply turned the knob and the door swung slowly open. There stood Stefano with his clothes all rumpled and his eyes shining brighter than they ever had before. "Good morning," he said. "It is time to leave for Peru. There's just room for 3 orphans, myself and the Jeep, so get a move on." "We told you yesterday that you weren't going," Violet said. She hoped her voice sounded braver than she felt. "It is your Uncle Monty who isn't going," Stefano said, and raised the part of his forehead where his eyebrow should have been. "Don't be ridiculous," Klaus said. "Uncle Monty wouldn't miss this expedition for the world." "Ask him," Stefano said, and the Baudelaire saw a familiar expression on his face. His mouth scarcely moved, but his eyes were shining, as if he had just told a joke. "Why don't you ask him? He is down in the Reptile Room." "We will ask him," Violet said. "Uncle Monty has no intention of letting you take us to Peru alone." She rose from the bed and took the hands of her siblings and walked quickly past Stefano, who was smirking in the doorway. "We will ask him," Violet said again, and Stefano gave a little bow as the children walked out of the room. The hallway was strangely quiet and blank as the eyes of a skull. "Uncle Monty?" Violet called at the end of the hallway. Nobody answered. Aside from a few creaks on the steps, the whole house was eerily quiet, as if it had been deserted for many years. "Uncle Monty?" Klaus called at the bottom of the stairs. They heard nothing. Standing on tiptoe, Violet opened the enormous door of the Reptile Room, and for a moment the orphans stared into the room, as if hypnotized, entranced by the odd blue light which the sunrise made as it shone through the glass ceiling and walls. In the dim glow, they could see only silhouettes of the various reptiles, as they moved around in their cages or slept, curled into shapeless dark masses. Their footsteps echoing off the glimmering walls, the 3 siblings walked through the Reptile Room towards the far end where Uncle Monty's library lay waiting for them. Even though the dark room felt mysterious and strange, it was a comforting mystery and a safe strangeness. They remembered Uncle Monty's promise that if they took time to learn the facts, no harm would come to them here in the Reptile Room. However, as you and I remember, that Uncle Monty's promise was laden with dramatic irony. And now, here in the early morning light of the Reptile Room, that irony was going to come to fruition, a phrase which here means the Baudelaires were finally going to learn of it. For just as they reached the books, the 3 siblings could see a large, shadowy mass huddled in the far corner. Nervously, Klaus switched on one of the reading lamps to get a better look. The shadowy mass was Uncle Monty. His mouth was slightly agape, as if he were surprised, and his eyes were wide open, but he didn't appear to see them. His face, usually so rosy, was very, very pale, and under his left eye there were 2 small holes, right in a line, the sort of mark made by the fangs of a snake. "Tu vas soon?" Sonny asked and tugged at his pant leg. Uncle Monty did not move. As he had promised, no harm had come to the Baudelaire orphans in the Reptile Room, but a great harm had come to Uncle Monty. Chapter 7. My, a voice said from behind them, and the Baudelaire orphans turned to find Stefanos standing there, the black suitcase with the shiny silver padlock in his hands and a look of brummagem surprise on his face. Brummagem is such a rare word for fake that even Klaus didn't know what it meant, but the children did not have to be told that Stefano was pretending to be surprised. What a terrible accident has happened here. Snake bite. Whoever discovers this will be most upset. "You," Violet began to say, but her throat fluttered as if the fact of Uncle Monty's death were food that tasted terrible. "You..." Stefano took no notice. Of course, after they discover that Dr. Montgomery is dead, they'll wonder what became of those repulsive orphans he had lying around the house. But by then they'll be gone. Speaking of which, it's time to leave. The Prospero sails at 5 o'clock from Hazy Harbor, and I'd like to be the first passenger aboard. That way, I'll have time for a bottle of wine before lunch." "How could you?" Klaus whispered hoarsely. He couldn't take his eyes off Uncle Monty's pale, pale face. "How could you do it? How could you murder him?" "Why, Klaus, I'm surprised," Stefano said, and walked over to Uncle Monty's body. "A smarty-pants boy like you should be able to figure out that your chubby old uncle died from a snake bite, not from murder. Look at those teeth, Mark. Look at his pale, pale face. Look at these staring eyes." "Stop it," Violet said. "Don't talk like that." "You're right," Stefano said. "There is no time for chit-chat. We have a ship to catch. Let's move." "We're not going anywhere with you," Klaus said. His face was pinched with the effort of focusing on their predicament rather than going to pieces. "We will stay here until the police come." "And how do you suppose the police will know to come?" Stefano said. "We will call them," Klaus said, in what he hoped was a firm tone of voice, and he began to walk towards the door. Stefano dropped his suitcase, the shiny silver padlock making a clattering sound as it hit the marble floor. He took a few steps and blocked Klaus's way, his eyes wide and red with fury. "I am so tired," Stefano snarled, "of having to explain everything to you. You're supposed to be so very smart. Yet you always seem to forget about this." And he reached into his pocket and pulled out the jagged knife. "This is my knife. It is very sharp and very eager to hurt you. Almost as eager as I am. If you don't do what I say, you will suffer bodily harm. Is that clear enough for you? Now get in the Jeep." The Baudelaire orphans were too terrified to fight Stefano. Taking a last look at their poor Uncle Monty, the 3 children followed Stefano to the door of the Reptile Room to get into the Jeep. To add insult to injury, a phrase which here means forcing to do someone an unpleasant task when they're already very upset, Stefano forced Violet to carry a suitcase out of the house, but she was too lost in her own thoughts to care. She was remembering the last conversation that she and her siblings had had with Uncle Monty, and thinking with a cold rush of shame that it hadn't really been a conversation at all. You will recall, of course, that on the ride home from seeing zombies in the snow, the children had been so worried about Stefano that they hadn't said a word to Uncle Monty, and that when the Jeep had arrived at the house, the Baudelaire orphans had dashed up to hash out the situation without even saying good night to the man who now lay dead under a sheet in the Reptile Room. As the youngsters reached the Jeep, Violet tried to remember if they'd even thanked him for taking them to the movies, but the night was all a blur. She thought that she, Klaus, and Sonny had probably said, "Thank you, Uncle Monty," when they were standing together at the ticket booth, but she couldn't be sure. Stefano opened the door of the Jeep and gestured with a knife, ushering Klaus and Sunny into the tiny back seat, and Violet, the black suitcase heavy on her lap, into the front seat beside him. The orphans had a brief hope that the engine would not start when Stefano turned the key in the ignition, but this was a futile hope. Uncle Monty took very good care of his Jeep, and it started right up. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny looked behind them as Stefano began to drive along the snake-shaped hedges. At the sight of the Reptile Room, which Uncle Monty had filled so carefully with the specimens, and in which he was now a sort of specimen himself, the weight of the Baudelaire's despair was too much for them, and they quietly began to cry. It is a curious thing, the death of a loved one. We all know that our time in this world is limited, and eventually all of us will end up underneath some sheet never to wake up. Yet it is always a surprise when it happens to someone we know. It is like walking up the stairs to your bedroom in the dark and thinking that there is one more stair than there is. Your foot falls down through the air, and there is a sickly moment of dark surprise as you try to readjust to the way that you thought of things. The Baudelaire orphans were crying not only for Uncle Monty, but for their own parents, and this dark and curious feeling of falling that accompanies any great loss. What was to happen to them? Stefano had heartlessly slaughtered the man who was supposed to be watching over the Baudelaires, and now they were all alone. What would Stefano do to them? He was supposed to be left behind when they went to Peru, and now he would be leaving with them on the Prospero. And what terrible things would happen in Peru? Would anyone rescue them there? Would Stefano get his hands on the fortune? And what would happen to the three children afterwards? These are frightening questions, and if you are thinking about such matters, they require your full attention, and the orphans were so immersed in thinking about this that they didn't realize that Stefano was about to collide with another automobile until the moment of impact. There was a horrible noise of tearing metal and glass as a black car crashed into Uncle Monty's Jeep, throwing the children to the floor with a jarring thump that felt as though it left the Baudelaire's stomachs up on the seat. The black suitcase lurched until Violet's shoulder and then forward into the windshield, which immediately cracked into a dozen places so it looked like a spiderweb. Stefano gave a cry of surprise and turned the steering wheel this way and that, but the two vehicles were locked together and with another thump veered off the road into a small pile of mud. It is a rare occurrence when a car accident can be called a stroke of good luck, but that was most certainly the case here. With the snake-shaped hedges still clearly visible behind them, the Baudelaire's journey towards Hazy Harbor had stopped. Stefano gave another sharp cry, this one of rage. "Blasted furnaces of hell!" he shouted, as Violet rubbed her shoulder to make sure that she wasn't seriously hurt. Klaus and Sunny got up cautiously from the Jeep floor and looked at the cracked windshield. There appeared to be only one person in the other car, but it was still hard to tell, as that vehicle had clearly suffered more damage than Monty's Jeep. Its entire front had pleated itself together, like an accordion, and one of the hubcaps were spinning noisily on the pavement of Lousy Lane, making blurry circles as if it were a giant coin that someone had dropped. The driver was dressed in gray and making a rough hacking sound as he opened the crumpled door of the car and struggled his way out. He made the hacking sound again and then reached into the pocket of his suit and pulled out a white handkerchief. "It's Mr. Poe!" Klaus cried. It was Mr. Poe, coughing away as usual, and the children were so delighted to see him that they found themselves smiling despite their horrible circumstance. "Mr. Poe! Mr. Poe!" Violet cried, reaching around Stefano's suitcase to open the passenger door. Stefano reached out an arm and grabbed her sore shoulder, turning his head slowly so that each child saw his shining eyes. "This changes nothing," he hissed at them. "This bit of luck for you, but it is your last bit of luck. The three of you will be back in this car with me and headed towards Hazy Harbor in time to catch the Prospero, I promise you." "We'll see about that," Violet replied, opening the door and sliding out from beneath the suitcase. Klaus opened his door and followed her, carrying Sunny. "Mr. Poe! Mr. Poe!" "Violet," Mr. Poe said. "Violet Baudelaire, is that you?" "Yes, Mr. Poe," Violet said. "It is all of us. We're so grateful we ran into you like this." "Well, I wouldn't say that," Mr. Poe said. "It was clearly the other driver's fault. You ran into me." "How dare you!" Stefano shouted, and got out of the car himself, wrinkling his nose at the smell of horseradish that filled the air. He stomped over to where Mr. Poe was standing, but halfway there the children saw his face change from one of pure rage to one of emotion. confusion, and sadness. "I'm sorry," he said in a high, fluttery voice. "This whole thing is my fault. I'm so distressed by what's happened. I wasn't paying any attention to the rules of the road. I hope you're not hurt, Mr. Poe." "It's Poe," Mr. Poe said. "My name is Poe. I am not hurt, luckily. It looks as though no one was hurt. I wish the same could be said for my car, but who are you, and what are you doing with the Butler children?" "I'll tell you who he is," Klaus said. "He's—" "Please, Klaus," Mr. Poe admonished, a word which here means reprimanded Klaus, even though he was interrupting for a very good reason. "It is not polite to interrupt." "My name is Stefano," Stefano said, shaking Mr. Poe's hand. I was Dr. Montgomery's assistant." "What do you mean, was?" Mr. Poe asked. "Were you fired?" "No, Dr. Montgomery—" "Oh, excuse me." Stefano turned away and pretended to dab at his eyes as if he were too sad to continue. Facing away from Mr. Poe, he gave the orphans a big wink before continuing. "I'm sorry to tell you, Mr. Doe, Montgomery is dead." "Poe," Mr. Poe said. "He's dead? That's terrible. What happened?" "I don't know," Stefano said. "It looked like a snake bite to me, but I don't know anything about snakes. That's why I was going into town to get a doctor." The children seemed too upset to be left alone. "He's not taking us to get a doctor," Klaus shouted. "He's taking us to Peru." It's a picture. "You see what I mean," Stefano said to Mr. Poe, patting Klaus's head. "The children are obviously very distressed. Dr. Montgomery was going to take them to Peru today." "Yes, I know," Mr. Poe said. "That's why I hurried over this morning to finally bring them their luggage. Klaus, I know that you're confused and upset over this accident, but please try to understand that if Dr. Montgomery is really dead, the expedition is canceled." "But Mr. Poe," Klaus said indignantly. "Please," Mr. Poe said. "This is a matter for adults to discuss, Klaus. Clearly a doctor needs to be called." "Well, why don't you drive up onto the house," and Stefano said, "and I'll take the children and find a doctor." "Jose!" Sonny shrieked, which probably meant something like "no way." "Why don't we all go to the house," Mr. Poe said, "and call for a doctor?" Stefano blinked, and for a second his face grew angry again, before he was able to calm himself and answer smoothly. "Of course," he said. "I should have called earlier. Obviously, I'm not thinking as clearly as you. Here, children, get back in the Jeep and Mr. Poe will follow us." "We're not getting back in that car with you," Klaus said firmly. "Please, Klaus," Mr. Poe said. "Try to understand. There has been a serious accident. All of the other discussion will have to be put aside. The only trouble is I'm not sure my car will start. It's very smashed up." "Try the ignition," Stefano said. Mr. Poe nodded and walked back to his car. He sat in the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine made a rough, wet noise. It sounded quite a bit like Mr. Poe's coughs, but it did not start. "I'm afraid the engine is quite dead," Mr. Poe called out. "And before long," Stefano muttered to the children, "you will be too." "I'm sorry," Mr. Poe said. "I couldn't hear you." Stefano smiled. "I said, that's too bad. Well, why don't I take the orphans back to the house and you walk behind us? There isn't room for everyone." Mr. Poe frowned. "But the children's suitcases are here. I don't want to leave them unattended. Why don't we put the luggage into your car and the children and I will walk back to the house?" Stefano frowned. "Well, one of the children should ride with me so I won't get lost." Mr. Poe smiled. "But you can see the house from here. You won't get lost." "Stefano doesn't want us to be alone with you," Violet said, finally speaking up. She had been waiting for the proper moment to make her case. "He's afraid that we will tell you who he really is and what he's up to." "What is she talking about?" Mr. Poe asked Stefano. "I have no idea, Mr. Toe," Stefano replied, shaking his head and looking at Violet fiercely. Violet took a deep breath. "This man is not Stefano," she said, pointing at him. "He's Count Olaf, and he's here to take us away." "Who am I?" Stefano asked. "What am I doing?" Mr. Poe looked at Stefano up and down and shook his head. "Forgive the children," he said. "They are very upset. Count Olaf is a terrible man who tried to steal their money, and the youngsters are very frightened of him." "Do I look like this Count Olaf?" Stefano asked, his eyes shining. "No, you don't," Mr. Poe said. "Count Olaf had one long eyebrow and a clean-shaven face. You have a beard, and, if you don't mind me saying so, no eyebrows at all." "He shaved his eyebrow," Violet said, "and grew a beard. Anyone can see that. And he has the tattoo," Klaus cried. "The eye tattoo on his ankle. Look at the tattoo." Mr. Poe looked at Stefano and shrugged apologetically. "I'm sorry to ask you this," he said, "but the children seem so upset. And before we discuss anything further, I'd like to set their mind at ease. Would you mind showing me your ankle?" "I'd be happy to," Stefano said, giving the children a toothy smile. "Right or left?" Klaus closed his eyes and thought for a second. "Left," he said. Stefano placed his left foot on the bumper of Uncle Monty's Jeep. Looking at the Baudelaire orphans with his shiny, shiny eyes, he began to raise the leg of his stained, striped pants. Violet, Klaus, Sonny, and Mr. Poe all kept their eyes on Stefano's ankle. The pant leg went up like a curtain, rising to begin a play. But there was no tattoo of an eye to be seen. The Baudelaire orphans stared at a patch of smooth skin as blank and pale as poor Uncle Monty's stiff face. Chapter 8. While the Jeep sputtered ahead of them, the Baudelaire orphans trudged back towards Uncle Monty's house, the scent of horseradish in their nostrils, and a feeling of frustration in their hearts. It is very unnerving to be proven wrong, particularly when you are really right, and the person who is really wrong is the one who is proving you wrong and proving himself wrongly right, right? "I don't know how he got rid of the tattoo," Klaus said stubbornly to Mr. Poe, who was coughing into his handkerchief, "but that is definitely Count Olaf." "Klaus," Mr. Poe said when he had stopped coughing, "this is getting very tiresome, going over this again and again. We have just seen Stefano's unblemished ankle." "Unblemished means, we know what unblemished means," Klaus said, watching Stefano get out of Uncle Monty's Jeep and walk quickly to the house. "Without tattoos, but it is Count Olaf. Why can't you see that?" "All I can see," Mr. Poe said, "is what's in front of me. I see a man with no eyebrows, a beard, and no tattoos, and that is not Count Olaf. Anyway, even if by some chance the Stefano wishes you harm, you have nothing to fear. It is quite shocking that Dr. Montgomery has died, but we're not simply going to hand you and your fortune to his assistant. Why, this man can't even remember my name." Klaus looked at his siblings and sighed. It would be easier, they realized, to argue with the snake-shaped hedge than with Mr. Poe when he had made up his mind. Violet was about to try reasoning with him one more time when a horn honked behind them. The Baudelaires and Mr. Poe got out of the way of the approaching automobile, a small gray car with very skinny driver. The car stopped in front of the house, and the skinny person got out, a tall man in a white coat. "May we help you?" Mr. Poe called out as the children approached. "I'm Dr. Lucafont," the tall man said, pointing to himself with a big solid hand. "I received a call that there has been a terrible accident involving a snake." "You're already here?" Mr. Poe said, "but Stefano has scarcely had time to call, let alone for you to drive here." "I believe that speed is of the essence in an emergency, don't you?" Dr. Lucafont said. "And if an autopsy is to be performed, it should be done immediately." Of course, Mr. Poe said quickly. "I was just surprised." "Where's the body?" Dr. Lucafont asked, walking towards the door. "Stefano can tell you," Mr. Poe said, opening the door of the house. Stefano was waiting in the entryway, holding a coffee pot. "I'm going to make some coffee," he said. "Who wants some?" "I'll have a cup," Dr. Lucafont said. "Nothing like a hearty cup of coffee before starting a day's work." Mr. Poe frowned. "Shouldn't you take a look at Dr. Montgomery first?" "Yes, Dr. Lucafont," Stefano said. "Time is of the essence in an emergency, don't you think?" Yes, I suppose you're right," Dr. Lucafont said. "Poor Dr. Montgomery is in the Reptile Room," Stefano said, gesturing to where the Baudelaire's guardian still lay. "Please do a thorough examination, and then you may have some coffee." "You're the boss," Dr. Lucafont said, opening the door of the Reptile Room with an oddly stiff hand. Stefano led Mr. Poe into the kitchen, and the Baudelaires glumly followed. When one feels useless and unable to help, one can use the expression feeling like a fifth wheel, because if something has 4 wheels, such as a wagon or a car, there really is no need for a fifth. As Stefano brewed coffee for the adults, the 3 children sat down at the table, wondering if they had sat down at the kitchen table where they had first had coconut cake with Uncle Monty just a short time ago, and Violet, Klaus, and Sonny felt like 5th, 6th, and 7th wheels on a car that was going the wrong direction, towards Hazy Harbor and the departing Prospero. When I spoke to Dr. Lucafont on the phone, Stefanos said, I told him about the accident with your car. When he is done with his medical examination, he will drive you into town to get a mechanic, and I will stay here with the orphans. No, Klaus said firmly, we are not staying with him for an instant. Mr. Poe smiled as Stefano poured him a cup of coffee and looked sternly at Klaus. Klaus, I realize that you are very upset, but it is unexcusable for you to keep treating Stefano so rudely. Please apologize to him at once. No, Klaus cried. That's quite all right, Mr. Yo, Stefano said soothingly. The children are upset over Dr. Montgomery's murder, so I don't expect them to be on their best behavior. Murder, Violet said. She turned to Stefano and tried to look as if she were merely politely curious instead of enraged. Why did you say murdered, Stefano? Stefano's face darkened and his hands clenched at his side. It looked like there was nothing he wanted to do more than scratch out Violet's eyes. I misspoke, he said finally. Of course he did, Mr. Poe said, sipping from his cup, but the children can come with Dr. Lucafont and me if they feel more comfortable that way. I'm not sure they will fit, Stefano said, his eyes shining. It's a very small car, but if the children would rather come with me in the Jeep, we could follow you and Dr. Lucafont to the mechanic. The three orphans looked at one another and thought hard. Their situation seemed like a game, although this game had desperately high stakes. The object of the game was not to end up alone with Stefano, for when they did, he would whisk them away on the Prospero. What would happen then, when they were alone in Peru with such a greedy and despicable person they did not want to think about? What they had to think about was stopping it from happening. It seemed incredible that their lives hinged on a carpooling conversation, but in life it is often the tiniest details that end up being the most important. Why don't we ride with Dr. Lucafont, Violet said carefully, and Mr. Poe can ride with Stefano. Whatever for? Mr. Poe asked. I've always wanted to see the inside of a doctor's automobile, Violet said, knowing that this was a fairly lame invention. Oh, yes, me too, Klaus said. Please, can't we ride with Dr. Lucafont? I'm afraid not, Dr. Lucafont said from the doorway, surprising everyone. Not all three of you children, anyway. I have placed Dr. Montgomery's body in my car, which only leaves room for 2 more passengers. Have you completed your examination already? Mr. Poe said. The preliminary one, yes, Dr. Lucafont said. I will have to take the body for some further tests, but my autopsy shows that the doctor died of a snake bite. Is there any coffee left for me? Of course, Stefano answered, and poured him a cup. How can you be sure? Violet asked the doctor. What do you mean? Dr. Lucafont said quizzically. I can be sure there's coffee left because I see it right there. What I think Violet means, Mr. Poe said, is how can you be sure that Dr. Montgomery died of a snake bite? In his veins, I found the venom of the mamba de mal, one of the world's most poisonous snakes. Does this mean that there's a poisonous snake loose in the house? Mr. Poe asked. No, Dr. Lucafont said. The mamba de mal is safe in its cage. It must have gotten out, bitten Dr. Montgomery, and locked itself up again. What? Violet asked. That's a ridiculous theory. A snake cannot operate a lock by itself. Perhaps the other snake helped it. Dr. Lucafont said calmly, sipping his coffee. Is there anything here to eat? I've had to rush over without any breakfast. Your story does seem a little odd, Mr. Poe said. He looked questioningly at Dr. Lucafont, who was opening a cupboard and peering inside. Terrible accidents, I have found, are often odd, he replied. It can't have been an accident, Violet said. Uncle Monty is... She stopped. Uncle Monty was one of the world's most respected herpetologists. He never would have kept a poisonous snake in a cage it could open itself. If it wasn't an accident, Dr. Lucafont said, then someone would have to have done this on purpose. Obviously, you 3 children didn't kill him, and the only other person in the house was Stefano. And I, Stefano added quickly, hardly know anything about snakes. I have only been working here for 2 days, and scarcely had time to learn anything. It certainly does appear to be an accident, Mr. Poe said. I'm sorry, children. Dr. Montgomery seemed like an appropriate guardian for you. He was more than that, Violet said quietly. He was much, much more than an appropriate guardian. That's Uncle Monty's food, Klaus cried out suddenly, his face contorted in rage. He pointed at Dr. Lucafont, who had taken a can out of the cupboard. Stop eating his food! was only going to have a few peaches, Dr. Lucafont said. With one of his oddly solid hands, he held up a can of peaches Uncle Monty had bought only yesterday. Please, Mr. Poe said gently to Dr. Lucafont. The children are very upset. I'm sure you can understand that. Violet, Klaus, and Sonny, why don't you excuse yourselves for a little while? We have much to discuss, and you are obviously too overwrought to participate. Now, Dr. Lucafont, let's try to figure things out. You have room for 3 passengers, including Dr. Montgomery's body, and you, Stefano, have room for 3 passengers as well. So it's very simple, Stefano said. You and the corpse will go in Dr. Lucafont's car, and I will drive behind you with the 3 children. No, Klaus said firmly. Baudelaires, Mr. Poe said just as firmly. Will you 3 please excuse yourself? A foop, Sonny shrieked, which probably meant no. Of course we will, Violet said, giving Klaus and Sonny a significant look, and taking her siblings' hands, she half led them, half dragged them out of the kitchen. Klaus and Sonny looked up at their older sister and saw that something about her had changed. Her face looked more determined than grief-stricken, and she walked quickly, as if she were late for something. You will remember, of course, that even years later, Klaus would lie awake in bed, filled with regret that he didn't call out to the driver of the taxicab who had brought Stefano into their lives once more. But in this respect, Violet was luckier than her brother, for unlike Klaus, who was so surprised when he first recognized Stefano that moment passed him by, Violet realized, as she heard the adults drone on, that the time to act was now. I cannot say that Violet, years later, slept easily when she looked back on her life. There were too many miserable times for any of the Baudelaires to be peaceful sleepers. But she was always a bit proud of herself that she realized that she and her siblings should in fact excuse themselves from the kitchen and move to a more helpful location. What are we doing? Klaus asked. Where are we going? Sonny, too, looked questioningly at her sister, but Violet merely shook her head in answer and walked faster towards the door of the Reptile Room. And that's where we're going to end today. We'll give you a little preview of tomorrow. We have been reading from The Reptile Room, the second book in a series of unfortunate events, written by Lemony Snicket, illustrated by Brett Helquist, and published by Harper Collins. My name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye!